We walked into Mark's house, greeted by a packed room, faces familiar and new. The air buzzed with the clinking of glasses, laughter, and low music vibrating just enough to feel it underfoot. Sarah looked incredible in that sleek black dress of hers, hugging her curves in a way that caught more than a few glances. She stood beside me, her arm brushing against mine as we greeted Mark, flashing a smile that seemed just a bit too fixed, a bit too polished. But as the night wore on, her attention drifted faster than I'd ever seen. 1 minute, she was right beside me, laughing and joining in, and the next, her eyes were wandering across the room, landing on people I didn't recognize. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a side effect of the argument we'd had the night before, something about forgotten groceries or her sister's wedding plans. But with each passing moment, Sarah seemed to drift further away, and a nagging feeling gnawed at me, telling me that tonight was going to be different from any other party we'd ever been to. I caught her looking toward a group across the room, her gaze lingering on one person in particular, a man I'd never seen before. He was leaning against the bar, holding a whiskey glass, his grin a bit too confident for my taste. Her attention seemed fixed on him, and a subtle unease crept over me. There was something intentional in the way she kept glancing his way, as if waiting to see if he noticed her too. Sarah then excused herself to get a drink, and while I tried to shrug it off, my eyes couldn't help but follow her. She went straight to him, tilting her head, introducing herself, laughing a little too hard at whatever he said. My stomach knotted, but I kept telling myself it was just a casual chat. It couldn't be more than that. But it didn't stop there. She stayed by his side for most of the night, her posture relaxing with every drink she took. I attempted to engage in other conversations, but my gaze kept pulling back to them. Her hand brushed his arm, lightly, too lightly for it to seem deliberate, yet too familiar to feel innocent. I stood there, frozen, helpless, as I watched them lean in close, sharing laughter that seemed to sting every time I heard it. I drained my drink faster than I should have, trying to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. She was just being friendly, that's what I wanted to believe. But each passing moment made it harder to convince myself it was nothing. There was a growing closeness between them, a kind of connection that left me on the outside looking in. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop seeing it. As the evening dragged on, Sarah drifted further and further away from me. I ended up with a group of friends, trying to keep up with their jokes and stories, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. From across the room, I caught fleeting glimpses of her, her hand resting on the small of his back, his fingers grazing her arm. For the past hour, she hadn't so much as glanced in my direction. Then came the moment I dreaded, where casual friendliness slipped into something else. As the crowd grew more intoxicated, the energy shifted. People started dancing in little groups, the music pounding louder, and laughter turning sloppy. It was chaos, a blur of bodies and movement. But even in the middle of it all, I could still find her. I could still see Sarah, glued to that man, the line between playful flirting and something more unsettling beginning to blur right before me. I kept telling myself it was just the alcohol making me read too much into it. I wanted to believe she was innocent, but my trust was running thin. Something inside me cracked, a quiet voice whispering that maybe this wasn't just harmless fun. That perhaps there was more beneath the surface of her actions. As the hours wore on, the party's mood shifted even further, taking on a wild edge. I started noticing couples slipping off into side rooms, and I knew the night was starting to veer into dangerous territory. When Sarah suddenly excused herself from the man's side and slipped down the hallway, my entire body tensed. She didn't even look back my way before she disappeared. I stood there, hoping she'd return in a minute, giving me a smile that would put me at ease. But she didn't. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, a burst of laughter drifting from somewhere down the hall. Then, as if someone had cranked up the volume, the sound grew louder, followed by a man's voice, slurred and drunk, rising above the music. "Stop. Stop. You're naked." My breath caught, and a cold knot in my stomach twisted into something darker. I knew that voice. It was him. Before I even realized it, I was pushing through the crowd, weaving between swaying bodies and broken conversations, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I reached the hallway, I saw her. Sarah came rushing out of a side room, completely naked, her face flushed, hair tangled in every direction. For a split second, the world tilted beneath me. It was surreal, like stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Her bare feet slapped against the wooden floor as she stumbled into the main room, laughing drunkenly, unaware of the stunned faces turning toward her. I froze, every nerve in my body locking up as the scene played out in slow motion. Conversations died off one by one as people realized what they were witnessing. My wife, exposed and laughing, without a trace of shame. She stumbled, nearly tripping, and the man from earlier, the one she'd been glued to all night, followed her out, hurriedly pulling his shirt back on. His voice, amused and frustrated, cut through the silence. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing?" Every eye was on us then. The room sank into a thick silence, heavy with shock and judgment. Sarah, oblivious to the weight of what had just happened, collapsed in a heap on the floor, her drunken giggles fading into confused murmurs. And there I stood, rooted to the spot, humiliated beyond anything I'd ever known. The shame hit like a tidal wave, crashing down and washing away any last bit of pride I had. I could feel every gaze fixed on me, searing through me, and my mind screamed to do something, to cover her up, to salvage any scrap of dignity. But all I managed was to stand there, helpless and exposed, as though I were the one stripped bare in front of everyone. Something inside me snapped. Rage surged through my veins, and before I knew what I was doing, I was moving toward the man she'd spent the night with. My fist connected with his jaw before I even registered swinging it, and we both went down to the floor. Chaos erupted, people scrambling to separate us as I swung wildly, blinded by fury, desperate to regain even a sliver of my pride. But deep down, I knew the damage was done. She was gone. Or maybe I'd already left her, right there in that room. It's strange how heartbreak seems to warp time, dragging moments into slow motion, like scenes from a film. But the decision to walk out of that house, leaving Sarah behind, naked, drunk, and completely oblivious to the damage she'd done, that took no time at all. My legs moved on their own, driven by an instinct to escape before the humiliation suffocated me completely. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The cold night air hit me hard as I stumbled out of Mark's house, my breath ragged and uneven. The noise from the party faded the second I reached the street. I gripped my car door with shaking hands, hoping the cool metal would somehow steady me, but it did nothing. My mind was racing, replaying every detail from inside, the bare skin, the smug grin on his face, the shocked whispers and gasps from the crowd. I started the car, hands trembling on the wheel, and just drove. I wasn't thinking about where I was headed, all I wanted was to get away. Streetlights streaked across the windshield, casting fleeting shadows that twisted and bent, mirroring the storm inside me. First came the rage, hot and fierce, but it faded quickly, replaced by something much worse, something quieter. Shame. The kind of shame that clings to you, burrows into your bones, reminding you that it'll never wash away. I wanted to scream, to break something, anything, but all I could do was grip the wheel until my knuckles turned white. I have no idea how long I drove. Hours, maybe. The streets turned into a blur of neon signs and empty intersections, one after another. Eventually, I pulled into a deserted parking lot and just sat there, the engine idling beneath me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, lighting up again and again with texts, probably from Sarah. Maybe she was looking for me. Maybe she wasn't. I didn't care enough to check. When I finally shut off the engine, silence filled the car, thick and suffocating. I stared through the windshield, watching the night stretch out, endless and empty. What the hell just happened? That question echoed in my head, each time more bitter than the last. How had we ended up here? Sarah and I had built a life together, something solid, something I thought was unbreakable. We'd survived arguments, rough financial stretches, and more family drama than I could count. But none of that prepared me for this. Nothing prepared me for the image of her, my wife, so freely exposed in front of a room full of strangers, all for the entertainment of some guy I didn't even know. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I was still there, unmoved. A weight settled on my chest, heavy with exhaustion, but I knew sleep wouldn't come even if I tried. So I drove home, not because I wanted to be there, but because I had nowhere else to go. I had barely stepped through the front door when I heard the knocking. At first, I thought it was just leftover noise from the chaos of the night, echoing in my head. But the sound grew louder, more urgent, accompanied by muffled sobs. It was Sarah, on the other side of the door, crying, pleading for me to let her in. "Please let me in," she whimpered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, I thought about opening it, letting her stumble inside, her face streaked with tears and regret. Maybe she'd come up with an excuse that would make it all seem like a drunken mistake. Maybe I'd even believe her. But I didn't move. I just stood there, listening to her cry through the door, my heart twisted in a mess of anger and sorrow. Letting her in meant facing the reality of everything that had happened, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. "Please talk to me," she begged, her voice breaking again. It didn't mean anything, I swear. I clenched my fists, pressing them against the door, as if that pressure alone could hold me together, my pride, my sanity, what little dignity I had left. But I could feel the cracks widening. "I love you," she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I shut my eyes tight, every word cutting deeper than the last. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let her in. Eventually, her sobs quieted, replaced by a heavy silence. I waited until I heard her footsteps fade down the hall, followed by the thud of her car door closing. Then, I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the door, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The full weight of what had happened hit me all over again, crashing over me like a wave I couldn't escape. I thought that was the worst of it, but I was wrong. Around 3 p.m., my phone buzzed. This time, it wasn't a call or a text. It was a video message. Without thinking, I opened it, and within seconds, my world shattered all over again. It was Sarah, and the man she'd been clinging to all night, recording everything. The video showed it all. Their whispered conversations, the stolen touches, the moment they'd slipped away from the crowd together, it was all there. Then it cut to the part one had dreaded most. She was fully exposed, sprinting out of the room in a drunken daze, while laughter echoed in the background, sharp and taunting. The camera followed her as she stumbled down the hallway, the man's voice dripping with amusement. "There she goes. Your perfect little wife." I dropped the phone like it was on fire, my chest seizing with a fury so intense it felt like it might rip me apart from the inside. This wasn't just some drunken mistake, a night that went too far. It was calculated. It was degrading. And now there was evidence, proof that would live on, waiting to surface and tear apart the last bits of dignity I clung to. I stared at the phone, my pulse pounding in my ears, the walls closing in tighter around me with every breath. The betrayal sat heavy on my soul, dark and suffocating. Something primal awoke within me. This wasn't going to end with apologies or a teary explanation. No, this was war. I needed to confront him, the man who had reduced my wife and my life to some cheap thrill, smashing it all apart in one twisted night. Without hesitation, I snatched my keys and stormed out of the house. My mind was fixated on one thing and one thing only. The drive was a blur, nothing but the stretch of pavement under my wheels, each mile swallowed by the simmering rage that pulsed like a second heartbeat in my chest. I wasn't thinking clearly, all I knew was that I needed to find him, the man who turned my wife into a public spectacle and dragged me into his own personal nightmare. By the time I reached his apartment complex, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers tingled, trying to calm the storm inside me. But I couldn't. He had filmed her, mocked me, and that video was now a ticking time bomb, ready to detonate my life again at any moment. I slammed the car door behind me and marched toward the building. My heart thundered in my chest as I scanned the directory by the entrance, finding his name, Nathan Cole, neatly marked next to a number. Apartment 204. The elevator rattled as it carried me to the second floor, the stale air thick with the stench of old cigarette smoke. When I glanced at my reflection in the scratched mirror, I hardly recognized the person staring back. My eyes were bloodshot, jaw locked tight with tension, and something wild glinted in my gaze, something unfamiliar and dark. As the elevator doors opened, I made my way down the hallway, each step heavy with purpose. The faint sound of a TV drifted from one of the apartments, but otherwise, the place was silent. When I reached 204, I stopped, my hand hovering over the buzzer. For a split second, a flicker of doubt wormed its way in. Was this really the solution? Would confronting him really make any of this pain go away? But then I remembered that video, the way Sarah laughed with him, the way he sneered at the camera like I was nothing but a punchline. The rage came rushing back, silencing every trace of doubt. I pounded on the door, feeling the anger pulse in my fists. After a moment, I heard footsteps inside, slow and unhurried. The door opened, and there he was, Nathan. He looked taller than I remembered, hair tousled, that lazy grin plastered across his face like he already knew why I was there. Well, he drawled, leaning casually against the doorframe. Didn't think I'd see you again so soon. His voice dripped with mockery, and the sight of him standing there, so smug and self-assured, made my blood boil. Without a word, I lunged. My first punch hit him square in the jaw, knocking him backward into the apartment. He staggered, but I didn't give him a chance to recover. I was on him, swinging blindly, fists landing on his face, his ribs, wherever I could. I wasn't thinking, wasn't even feeling. All I knew was the overpowering need to hurt him, to erase the shame he'd thrown over my life. He tried to fight back, but his reflexes were dulled by alcohol. I felt the crack of his nose under my knuckles, heard him grunt as he crumpled to the floor, blood already smearing his face. For a moment, he just lay there, dazed and blinking. But it wasn't enough. I grabbed his collar, hauling him up and slamming him against the wall, rage pouring out like a flood. Did you think this was funny? I growled, my voice raw. Did you think you could wreck my life and get away with it? He coughed, spitting blood onto the floor. It was just a joke, man, just a stupid joke. A joke. That's all this was to him, a drunken prank, a quick laugh at my expense, something he'd forget by morning. But for me, it was everything. I slammed him harder against the wall, feeling him go slack under my grip. You don't get to walk away from this, I hissed. His face twisted in pain, the smug look finally replaced by fear. Okay, stop, he gasped. Just, take it easy. I wanted to keep going, to pummel him until he felt even a fraction of the humiliation that had torn through me. But something cold and terrifying whispered in the back of my mind, if you don't stop now, you won't be able to stop. I let go, watching as he slumped to the floor, clutching his ribs, his face swollen and bloody. Standing over him, chest heaving, I forced my voice into a low, steady tone. You don't ever come near me or my wife again, I said, each word deliberate. If I see you, if I even hear your name, I'll finish what I started. Got it? He nodded weakly, his hands raised in surrender. I turned, stumbling out the door, my head swimming with adrenaline and exhaustion. As I walked back into the hallway, a strange numbness settled over me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just emptiness. I'd hurt him, made him pay, but somehow it still didn't feel like enough. When I got home, the house was silent. I sat on the couch, my fists throbbing from the fight, and stared blankly at the wall. My mind drifted back to Sarah, to her tear-streaked face at the door earlier, her desperate pleas to be let inside. Then, beside me, my phone buzzed again. Another text from her. Asterisk, please let me explain. I was drunk. It didn't mean anything, asterisk. I stared at the message, feeling numb. I wanted to believe her, to think that somehow this could all be undone. That maybe, just maybe, there was a way back from this. But the memory of that video wouldn't let me. Deep down, I knew. There was no going back. The days that followed were a blur, like I was moving through someone else's life. Nothing felt real, not the constant buzzing of my phone with Sarah's endless texts, not the stale silence that had filled every corner of the house, and certainly not the storm of emotions inside me, churning with no end in sight. I stayed shut away for days, locking the doors, curtains drawn tight, letting the world carry on without me. Sleep barely touched me. When it did, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding from dreams of her, Sarah's bare figure in that hallway, the laughter, the humiliation. The images were seared into my mind. There was no escape. I ignored her messages as long as I could, but she was relentless. Every few hours, another text appeared, each one sounding more desperate. Asterisk, please talk to me. I can't stand this silence. It didn't mean anything, I swear, asterisk. Part of me, the part that still loved her, wanted to answer. To let her explain, to hope that somehow this was all just a terrible, drunken mistake. But another part of me, the part that had watched her flirt with Nathan all night, the part that had seen her collapse naked in front of everyone, knew better. Some things can't be erased with apologies. By the third day, the silence was choking me. I needed to breathe. Without checking my phone or telling anyone, I left the house. I didn't care where I ended up, I just needed to get away from the memories, from her, from myself. I drove for hours, winding through suburbs, past coffee shops and parks filled with people who had no idea how lucky they were to have normal lives. Eventually, I found myself at the park where Sarah and I used to go when we first started dating. It felt surreal, sitting on the same bench where we'd once planned a future together, back when things felt simple and sure. I stayed there a long time, staring at the lake, watching the wind ripple across the water. But peace wouldn't come. The weight of the past sat heavy on my chest, making it hard to breathe. When I finally returned home, the sun had set, and there she was, waiting for me. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a coat far too thin for the chilly autumn night, her eyes red and swollen from crying. As I pulled into the driveway, she stepped forward, her hands shaking at her sides. "I need to talk to you," she whispered, her voice raw, worn from exhaustion. For a moment, I thought about walking right past her, locking her out again, letting her drown in her own guilt. But something inside me cracked, just enough to let her in. Without a word, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Sarah followed quietly, closing the door behind her. She stood there in the entryway, fidgeting with the hem of her coat, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The guilt was written all over her face, her lips quivering as she searched for the right words. "I know I messed up," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I did was unforgivable." I stayed silent, leaning against the wall, waiting. She continued, her hands twisting together, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking. Nathan, he kept buying me drinks, and I didn't know how to stop. Her voice trailed off, tears glistening in her eyes. I felt a flicker of something, sympathy, maybe, but it was buried so deep under layers of anger and betrayal that it was barely there. "You didn't know how to stop." I repeated, my tone cold. "That's what you're saying." Sarah winced, her shoulders slumping under the weight of my words. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. I swear I didn't. I shook my head slowly, the bitterness rising in my throat. You didn't just hurt me, Sarah. You humiliated me. In front of everyone. Her breath hitched, and she stepped closer, her eyes full of desperation. Please. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I love you, and I can't lose you. Please tell me we can fix this. Fix this, as if somehow patching up what she'd done would erase the memories of that night, the laughter, the video, the betrayal. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see the woman I had married. I saw a stranger, someone who had made choices I couldn't begin to understand, choices that had torn apart everything we'd built together. I don't know if I can, I said quietly, my voice cracking under the weight of my own truth. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, burying her head in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, unmoving, unsure what to do. The sight of her broken like this should have stirred something in me. But instead, I felt only exhaustion. I sat down across from her, rubbing my temples, trying to find a moment of clarity in the chaos. Why Nathan? I asked, almost to myself. Why did you go to him? Sarah sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. I don't know, she whispered. He was just there, and I felt lost, like I wasn't good enough anymore, like we weren't good enough. Her words hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. I'd known things between us weren't perfect, but I never imagined she felt that way. So, you decided to throw everything away? I asked bitterly. Because you felt what? Bored? Insecure? She shook her head frantically. No, it wasn't that. It was just a mistake. A stupid, drunken mistake. I was trying to feel something, anything. But it wasn't worth it. None of it was worth losing you. I stared at her, feeling the weight of her confession settle over me like a heavy stone. It wasn't an excuse, not one that made any real sense, but it was the truth. And the truth, ugly as it was all we had left. For the first time since that night, I felt the edges of my anger soften, just a little. Not enough to forgive her, not yet, but enough to make me wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. I don't know if I can forgive you, I admitted, my voice low. But I know I can't keep living like this, hating you. Hating everything. I knew I couldn't keep going on like this, full of resentment. Sarah nodded slowly, her tears still streaming, but there was something lighter in her expression, like a weight had been lifted. I'll do anything, she whispered. Whatever it takes. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. I don't know what that looks like yet. But if we try, everything has to change. Everything. She nodded again, a faint glimmer of hope breaking through her tear-streaked face. We sat there in silence, the past still looming between us, heavy but no longer unbearable. It wasn't a resolution, not yet. But it was a start, a small step, at least. The days that followed Sarah's confession were stifling in their own way. We agreed to try, to attempt to rebuild whatever was left of us, though it wasn't the kind of choice made with conviction. It felt more like standing on the edge of a crumbling bridge, knowing that moving forward was risky but realizing that falling was the only other option. Our home became a quiet battlefield, where every glance and conversation was loaded, as if any wrong move could send us spiraling back into the chaos. We slept in the same bed, but a cold, invisible wall separated us. Sarah would lie curled up on her side, and I kept to mine, staring at the ceiling for hours, pretending to sleep. Some nights, I'd hear her crying softly, muffled beneath the blankets, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out. I wanted to feel sympathy for her, for us, but every time I tried, the memory of that night surged back like a dark wave, swallowing whatever warmth might have been left in me. We struggled to find a new rhythm, but everything felt awkward and forced. Conversations about groceries or chores became strange, like we were actors in a play we'd lost interest in. Sarah stopped drinking altogether. I hadn't asked her to, she'd made the decision herself. Maybe it was her way of proving she was serious, that she wanted to change. But her sobriety couldn't erase the past, and no matter how she tried to avoid it, the shadow of that video haunted every moment we spent together. I hadn't told her about it. She didn't know the video existed. I kept that knowledge buried deep, too ashamed to admit that somewhere out there was footage of her betrayal, stashed away on a stranger's phone. The weight of it hung over me constantly, like a sword dangling by a thread. What if Nathan shared it with others? What if it surfaced online? What if one day it was used to humiliate me again, a brutal reminder that I'd been that man, the one who couldn't keep his wife loyal? I told myself I'd dealt with it by confronting him. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I hadn't fixed anything, I'd only lashed out in anger, hoping it would be enough. But it wasn't. She entered the room quietly, almost like she was afraid to disturb me. I glanced up briefly and saw her watching me, wearing that same guilt-ridden, nervous look she'd had since the party. She seemed smaller somehow, like she'd folded in on herself, waiting for me to say something, anything, that might hint at forgiveness. "Do you hate me?" she asked softly, sitting down across from me. Her question hung in the air between us, thick with unspoken meaning. "I don't know," I said, which was as close to the truth as I could get. "I hate what you did. I hate how it makes me feel." She nodded slowly, absorbing my words like she'd expected nothing less. "I hate it too," she whispered. "I hate myself for it." I wanted her regret to comfort me, but it didn't. That's when I realized remorse doesn't heal wounds the way people think it does. Her guilt didn't ease my pain, it only added another layer to the weight of everything we were struggling to untangle. The next morning, I woke up to another message from Nathan. My heart sank before I even read it. "We need to talk," I stared at the words, pulse pounding in my ears. I knew answering would be risky, reopening a wound that was nowhere near healing. But ignoring him felt even worse. I typed back quickly, "What do you want?" His reply came almost instantly. "I think you want to hear this. Meet me, I gritted my teeth, the memory of our last encounter flashing through my mind, the way I'd left him bleeding on the floor. The thought of seeing him again made my skin crawl, but the nagging fear of what he might do with the video left me with no choice. I didn't tell Sarah where I was going. She didn't ask, she knew better than to push. I met Nathan at a rundown coffee shop on the edge of town, the sort of place people go when they don't want to be found. He was already there when I walked in, sitting in a corner booth with a baseball cap pulled low over his bruised face. He looked up as I approached, giving me a half-smile that barely reached his eyes. "You hit harder than I expected," he said, his voice rough. I ignored the comment and sat down across from him. "What do you want?" He leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "Relax, man. I'm not here to stir up more trouble. I wanted to make things right." I scoffed. "You think you can fix this?" Nathan sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Look, I messed up. I thought it was funny at the time, but I see now that it wasn't." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a flash drive, and slid it across the table. "The video. I deleted it from my phone, but I figured you'd want this for peace of mind." I stared at the flash drive, my stomach churning. "Why?" I asked, my voice low. "Why give this to me?" Nathan shrugged. "Because I'm tired, man. Tired of being that guy. And maybe I just didn't want this hanging over either of us anymore." For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. I had spent so much time consumed with thoughts of revenge, of some dark retribution. But now, sitting across from the man who had humiliated me, all I felt was exhaustion. I took the flash drive and stood up, my legs unsteady. "If I ever see you again," I began, but he held up a hand. "You won't," he said simply. About a week later, I found myself sitting alone at the dining table, staring at the cracked screen of my phone. I scrolled through old messages, Sarah's texts from before it all fell apart, from when life was still whole. Photos of vacations, lazy mornings, silly little moments that had once seemed so trivial but now felt like relics of a different world. I left without another word. That night, I found myself sitting on the couch, the flash drive resting in my palm, feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Sarah walked into the room, her expression cautious, her eyes full of questions. "What's that?" she asked quietly. I turned the small plastic device over in my hand, the sharp edges pressing against my skin. "The video," I said flatly. "It's gone now. For good." She blinked, and her expression flickered somewhere between relief and something else, fear, maybe, or guilt. I leaned back, letting out a long, slow breath. The road ahead still looked long and full of uncertainty. Trust wasn't something I could summon overnight. And forgiveness? I wasn't sure if I'd ever get there. But for the first time, the weight of everything didn't feel quite so unbearable. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The flash drive sat in the drawer of my desk for weeks, untouched. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it, though I knew I should. Maybe a part of me wanted to hold on to it as leverage, a reminder of the power it held over both Sarah and me. Or maybe I was afraid that if I erased it completely, I'd have to face the fact that, no matter what I did, the memory of that night would never truly disappear. Sarah and I continued on, trying in that way people do when everything is broken, with only habit left to hold on to. We fell into a delicate routine, carefully avoiding the cracks that had fractured our lives. Every conversation was layered with unspoken rules: don't mention the past, don't bring him up, and don't ask for too much too soon. On the surface, life almost looked normal again. We went through the motions of a marriage. Grocery shopping on Saturdays, sitting at the table for dinner with half-hearted smiles, the occasional movie night where we'd sit side by side yet feel miles apart. We looked like a couple trying to rebuild, but I knew better. What we were doing wasn't rebuilding. It was survival. One night, months after everything had happened, I stood in the doorway to our bedroom, watching Sarah as she slept. In the dim light, with her hair spilling over the pillow and her breathing soft and steady, she looked peaceful. Innocent, almost. But appearances can be deceiving. I used to find comfort in moments like these, when the world felt quiet and safe. But now, all I could think about was how easily she'd let someone else into our lives, how quickly trust could be shattered, leaving only jagged edges. I still loved her, or at least, I thought I did. But love had grown tangled, complicated by resentment and doubt. Every time she touched me, I couldn't help but wonder if her mind drifted back to him. Every time she said she loved me, I questioned whether she meant it or if it was just another way to ease her guilt. Some nights, I lay awake beside her, trying to convince myself that forgiveness was possible. But forgiveness is a strange thing. People talk about it like it's a gift you give to someone else. But the truth is, it's a burden you carry alone. You forgive because you need to move forward, not because the other person necessarily deserves it. I wasn't sure if I had the strength to carry that burden. One rainy afternoon, Sarah sat across from me at the dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I could see something weighed on her, her gaze flicking toward me, hesitant, as if trying to gauge if I was ready to hear what she needed to say. "I know I hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence, "and I know you don't trust me. But I need to know if you think we'll ever be okay again." Her vulnerability hit me harder than I'd expected. I wanted to give her the answer she was searching for, to tell her that we could move forward, that maybe, eventually, things would go back to how they were. But I couldn't lie. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I want to say yes. But the truth is, I don't think things will ever be the same." She nodded slowly, her eyes welling up with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know how to make it right." "That's the thing," I said, leaning back in my chair. I don't think you can. And I don't think I can either. We sat there in silence, the weight of those words sinking between us like heavy stones. I'd spent so much time waiting for some resolution, some defining moment that would make everything fall into place. But life doesn't work like that. Some betrayals leave scars that never fully heal, and some wounds are ones you learn to live with. A few weeks later, I found myself standing by the lake we used to visit when we were younger. Sarah stayed home that day. I told her I needed some time alone, and for once, she hadn't argued. Standing at the edge of the water, feeling the wind's chill on my skin, I pulled the flash drive from my pocket. I rolled it between my fingers, feeling the weight of everything it represented: anger, loss, shame. And then, without allowing myself to hesitate, I tossed it into the lake. The splash was small, barely noticeable, but it felt like the end of something. Or maybe it was the beginning. When I returned home that night, Sarah was on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching me carefully. I sat beside her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I reached for her hand. She looked at me, surprised, then slowly laced her fingers through mine. "Where do we go from here?" she asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. But maybe that was okay. Maybe life wasn't about finding clear answers but learning to live with the unknown. "We just go," I said finally. She nodded, and for the first time in a long while, we sat together without the weight of the past pressing down on us. The future was still uncertain, still filled with questions we might never be able to answer. But in that moment, it was enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was all we needed.